can just get on with building stuff. So I don't know, if you compare like the Bakerloo line extension with like what Paris is doing with its metro, like London just can't build it because it's waiting for like Treasury approval. Paris can just do it because it can like tax the businesses that will benefit in that region. It is really, really hard to do because it's like tangled up with property tax reform, with like responsibility to different layers of government. I don't think we've quite yet grasped that. And if there's ever something for like a royal commission, because all those things are tangled together, I think sorting out fiscal devolution and property tax reform is a good candidate.
Great, thanks, James. Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I am really encouraged by what the government has done, and I hope will continue to do on planning. The bill's not yet through Parliament, so let's see where we end up, but I hope that they continue to be as ambitious as possible. And then post-legislation, I think there's a lot more they can do through guidance, and I really hope that we can see kind of great strides on that. It's something that the Conservative Party tried and failed to do. Rishi Sunak, made some efforts and didn't get it through Parliament. So I think it's great that the government is really tackling this, and I wish them every success and ambition. And alongside that, I think some of the things they've done relatedly on airport expansion is very good news. I think they've been, in principle, very enthusiastic about the Oxford-Cambridge arc. There's probably not enough detail in what that will actually mean in reality yet, but I think that those moves are really positive and definitely the right thing to do. And I suspect, things that previous governments have known are the right thing to do and haven't been able to get done. So it's fantastic for the country if this government can get it done. And on the more worrisome side, I think that reading the industrial strategy document, it's kind of got a very punchy opening about saying Britain is over-regulated and overburdened, which I agree with. And I think the government wholeheartedly believes, but I think that turning that into what is our real deregulation process and what is the, if you talk about you want to make it easier for businesses to operate in the UK, I actually think what they're doing, particularly, national insurance, arguably the minimum wage, some of the stuff that's coming up in the Employment Rights Bill, I think that those act in the opposite direction. And you might have good reasons for doing them, and you might say that on balance the trade-off is worth it, but I don't think we are really seeing a serious sort of wider deregulatory push, and I am really worried about employment in particular, and what the government has done so far I think is going to make it very difficult. I'm very worried about youth unemployment in particular, which I know the government is too, but I think that they are sort of pushing in two directions. So that's what makes me nervous.
Really interesting. Tim?
The best thing about the current government, I think, is Rachel Reeves, because she hasn't been that good a chancellor, but compared to the rest of her party, she's been absolutely outstanding. You cannot run a deficit as big as Britain and then believe the deficit doesn't matter. Whether her exact fiscal rules are correct or not is irrelevant. As John Kingman said in the Financial Times, when you're walking along a cliff in fog, you shouldn't argue about whether you need a handrail or whether it's in exactly the right place. And the sort of rubbish that people like Lou Haig have been writing in the newspapers recently, saying that we can ignore the markets, shows nothing has been learned from Liz Truss. I mean, we've literally tried that route and it failed. So I agree with you on unemployment and Rachel Reeves, and I'm not saying she's right on everything, but she is better than anyone else I've seen in the Labour Party. And in contrast to Eleanor, the thing I think they're doing worst on is planning. They've talked big, they have an amazing bill, but they keep making bad decisions or not making decisions at all. So last, I think it was October, they called in an 8,000 house planning application in Kent. Now, I grew up in Kent, I know the site well, I'm not going to say whether I think it should or should not be built. But they haven't made a decision yet. It's almost a year. And the inquiry is just plodding on. And apparently they called it in because they thought that Kent County Council might go too slowly. Well, pot, kettle. Similarly, there's a film industry, one of the classic big sectors we're doing well on, that wanted to expand in either Buckinghamshire or Berkshire, I can't remember which. And it was rejected by Matthew Pennycook. It's on a grey belt site on two grounds. Firstly, it had a large car park, and he thought people might drive to work. Well done, Matt. That's what people do outside London. If you create jobs, people drive to them. And secondly, he said the buildings would be as high as 1.5 metres above the prevailing height of agricultural buildings in the area. Well, I'm not that tall, but I'm taller than 1.5 metres. If you stick me on top of an agricultural building, you have not destroyed the countryside. So no matter what legislation they pass, if you have a planning minister who is that determined to ignore the Prime Minister's injunction to build, baby, build, which of those three words doesn't he get? But he's been left in post in the reshuffle, and that worries me a lot.
Anything you like about what the government's doing, Tim?
I like their fiscal discipline. No, I think there are many decent, hard-working ministers, and I don't think you should, by and large, judge a government in its first year. Particularly when a party has been out of office for that long. It takes a while, and I was a civil servant for ages. I worked in 6 departments. It takes a while as a minister to understand your arse from your elbow, to know what you can do and what you can't do.
But isn't the first year when you have the most kind of latitude to do difficult things, and if you miss that chance, it's gone?
Well, I think there's still a chance in the second year, and Rachel Reeves did take that chance in that she put up taxes a chunk. She did various things like extending free school meals, etc., childcare. They have done a bunch of things in the first year.
Okay.
Childcare was a Jeremy Hunt reducing that policy.
Oh, sorry, I was wrong on that one. There we are.
Yeah, Cheska, who's in the audience, is responsible for designing it.
Sorry.
Well, look, we've covered so much ground there. So why don't we pick up some of the themes on regional policy, which is where James started. I think, James, you covered both sides of the coin, if you like. There's some really positive signs in Manchester, as you say, but it is an area where I hear actually some disappointment about whether the government's really gone far enough in a kind of place-based strategy. Eleanor, Tim, what do you think about kind of place-based? You were a little bit sceptical, Eleanor, about the industrial strategy in general, but equally, Conservative governments too have done a lot to promote local devolution.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on that?
No, I think of them as quite different, actually. I think that devolution, saying actually our big cities should have more powers and more responsibility and more accountability, are like absolutely the right direction of travel. And I think that Conservative government started that with some of the city deals. I agree with you completely that it should go further. It's very difficult. All things that are worth doing pretty much are difficult. So I don't, say how easy it is. Yeah. I'm not so familiar with, but also a little bit more sceptical about some of the local authority reorganisation and how much bandwidth that is going to take. And I think if I had a choice, I would have put more bandwidth into saying let's focus on cities and how we can make those work better and devolve more powers to them, because I think they've got more growth opportunities. So no, I'm very pro a kind of place-based approach. I think that model of local accountability and responsibility and opportunity is definitely the right one.
But I agree with you. Place-based approach is almost used to cover 2 quite different policy objectives, one of which is promoting the growth of second cities, which is really core to economic growth, and another is about left-behind places, which might be really important in lots of ways, but is much less critical for the kind of UK growth story, and maybe those things get a bit...
Yeah, and I do think you should be really clear-eyed about what you're doing. If let's invest in this place because we think that the standard of living is low and the public services are low and there are no amenities and we want parks for the children of this town to be able to play in, I'm very supportive of that. I wouldn't dress it up as an economic strategy.
Yeah. Tim?
How many people here have been to South Bend, Indiana? Nope, it's not a world city, is it? 5 years ago, I was in Iowa. I was teaching at an American university, and I went to hear Pete Buttigieg speak. He then wanted to be the Democratic candidate. And he talked about his time as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And what was really striking was the range of revenue powers he had and the range of other powers he had, and they were clearly greater than Mark Drakeford had in Wales or Sadiq Khan had in London. So given that Pete Buttigieg is now out of work, I think the government should hire him to come over and for a week just write down all the powers he had and give them to any organisation or area in Britain that is bigger than South Bend. That will be a nice straightforward way of cutting through all the crap on what powers should be where. But I think the benefits will be social, not economic. Because as my colleague and co-author Henry Overman has shown, once you take into account the different qualification levels in different places in Britain, Britain is one of the most equal societies in the world. Corrected for your qualifications, you earn almost the same wherever you live in the country. And that means that, sure, we can make Manchester richer, but only by and large by making it more attractive to high qualification people. So when Treasury opened in Darlington and Beth Russell moved to the Northeast, the Director General, now second permanent secretary, she will have raised wages in the area, but only by reducing them in London. So it isn't necessarily a win-win. Some of the growth things we've done, which do have benefits, are zero-sum game. So I'm much more pessimistic about regional policy as a way of increasing GDP as opposed to making Britain more equal.
So, go on, James.
So where does that take you, Tim? Like, what is your solution to kind of the regional inequality problems?
Well, it's the same place as yours in that I'm happy to have a more equal Britain, but I don't think it is anything other than a zero-sum game. I'd also say that with the exception of Italy, every rich country north of the equator has a population moving south. Because it's warmer in the south and it's drier. If any of you find that the problem of living in London is it doesn't rain often enough, then I have a solution, and it is called Manchester, where it rains 50% more days of the year than in London. Or if you think London's a great city, but it's just too hot in summer, try Newcastle, 4 degrees colder in summer. It's the same temperature in winter, roughly, because they're both by the sea. But most people prefer to be a bit warmer, which is why, in America, Detroit is depopulating and Austin is growing. France, the same. Germany, the same. Germany's move from north to south is really quite profound. So, again, it's difficult. Britain is the only country whose location of population and housing was determined in the Industrial Revolution. We were as urbanised in 1845 as France and Germany were in 1945. And that gives us a very peculiar set of problems that are unique to us. And they are difficult and intractable. But I'm much more pessimistic than you are, or most people, on these things. Much more pessimistic.
So, Tim, I'm afraid you give me a perfect chance to plug some recent Resolution Foundation work, which looks again at Henry...
She owes me a tenner.
Looks again at Henry Overman's estimates, published towards the end of June, I think, and says, actually, if you take some more recent data, you do find much bigger place effects, and particularly for young people. And the IFS did an also excellent study that we published on the same day, and that actually for young people in particular, you take the same young people and you put them in London and they earn more, and that they actually keep some of that benefit when they move back. And I think that raises really profound questions for public policy about whether you try and correct for those effects, which means having particularly more firms headquartered outside of London, which seems to be where some of this effect comes from, or whether really, if it was your kid, what you'd tell them to do is go to London. And how we fix that, I think, is really important. But we mustn't just talk about regional policy. So planning, some differences of view on whether, and I've seen this too, whether the government is, I think, well, agreement they're moving in the right direction, and quite big questions about whether the bark is as bad as the bite. Is that the right way around? Anyway, Eleanor, are you persuaded by Tim that maybe they need to go further?
I think that I was clear that I would like them to be more ambitious, but I have also the sort of scars on my back of trying to do planning reform, and it is really hard for politicians to do this, and it's the sort of classic Jean-Claude Juncker line of, like, everyone agrees on what we have to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. And so I think we should all be sort of praising the government for trying to make a move in this direction, absolutely calling them out when we think they should go further. I agree with, I didn't know about the one in Kent, but the film studio I had also thought was a strange decision. So I totally agree with Tim, but I just think we need to collectively, in the sort of civic public sphere, say, yes, we embrace this, we know it's going to have trade-offs, there come with difficult choices, and we really support the politicians who are trying to do the right thing. Otherwise, they won't do it.
Yeah.
Can I just come back?
Yeah, of course.
So I think that the Juncker problem is a bit less severe for Labour than it is for the Conservatives, because the places we need to build as a country, like a lot of housing has to go in the southeast, the Oxcam arc. Electorally, that's quite hard for the Conservatives. Yeah. For Labour, much less so. So I think that for me is a big source of optimism for the next few years. Like, you've got a government that's much more able to do this. The reforms at the moment, I think, are kind of operating, they're tweaking the existing system and making them better. At some point, we may have to just go, should we just junk big bits of the existing system? Like, the classic example is I'm moving away from a discretionary system to a zonal planning system. When you do that in other countries, they did that move in New Zealand in some cities, it clearly has a big impact. And I think we will get to the point where you have to do something quite radical like that. But within the existing system, I think they're doing a lot of things.
So I think James is being far too generous to the Tories here, twice over. So if we go back to when the Tories were a new government and still had political capital, there were two things they could have done. First of all, they could have gone for massive densification in the centre of London, excluding conservation areas, which happened to be the Tory areas of central London, and that would have overcome the problem of opposition. But secondly, they could have taken a bunch of Tory seats where their majority was so large they would not expect to have lost. I was an advisor to Michael Gove when he had 66% of the vote in Surrey Heath. And the other was divided equally. He won 66, 11, 11, 11. Now, at that point, they could have built as many houses as they liked in Surrey Heath. He could have been burnt in effigy, and he would almost certainly have won the next election. And furthermore, then, with rebounding, we'd have had Surrey Heath East and Surrey Heath West, both of which would have had the characteristics of being Tory. They'd be town, not city. They'd be car, not public transport, etc. So actually, I think a sensible Tory government 10 years ago would have built a huge amount in the shires to create societies that are prone to living in a non-communitarian area. If you live in central London, you always see the power of the state because it's what provides the tube, it's what provides the buses, it's what provides all of the things that make London livable. So no, I think you're far too generous, the Tories. They could have done it and they should have done it and they shouldn't have listened to Teresa Villas. I was delighted. It's not often I'm delighted that a member of Parliament loses their seat, but I was delighted that she did.
Blame it on the Lib Dems.
Eleanor won't comment, but I am confident in her heart of hearts she knows what I mean.
Eleanor, I feel like I should give you a right of reply.
I definitely won't comment on individual politicians. I think that you are right, though, that there's a lot of things I look back on and think, I wish we had done that. That is absolutely true. We don't need to segue into the great things that the coalition government did do 10 years ago, because that's not useful at the time. But I agree, I wish we had done more on planning.
And I wonder if it's helpful to generalise this question a little bit, and actually, particularly for this conference, is the problem in growth policy that we don't know what to do, or is it that it involves two difficult trade-offs? You know, is it a lack of ideas or a lack of delivery? Tim, do you want to kick us off?
Well, I think it's a lack of decisions. So years ago, I'm going to all 4 party conferences, and so a week or so ago I was at the Reform Party conference where somebody said, we have to do the unthinkable whatever it is. And that took me back 20 years ago when someone said the same to Vince Cable, who was then Secretary of State for Business. And he paused and went forward saying, whatever it is. And the person said, yes. And he said, well, if I just shoot everybody who has an income lower than average, that will raise the average. And there was a pause, and Vince said, I think that's unthinkable for a reason. And I agree with Vince. I am not in favour of shooting poor people. But what we need is, and I'm sure I speak for the panel on that one, and hopefully the audience, but not everyone at the Reform Conference, it appears. What we need to do, though, is write down all of the things in Britain that do lower national income and then think which of these are thinkable and unthinkable. So that one is unthinkable, but the 1981 Michael Heseltine, Margaret Thatcher Wildlife and Countryside Act says you mustn't continue with development if you find any wild nesting bird. And as a result, a social housing project in the West Country has just been stopped for 6 weeks because of a nesting pigeon. They have had to pay the scaffolders 10,000 quid to rent the scaffolding for longer. They've had to stand down all the tradespeople who were demolishing the building. The project will now run into winter and almost certainly get delayed over the summer for a nesting pigeon.
But
now,
Tim,
I think that is in the silly category, not the unthinkable category.
But that's a great example, right? Because we can all sit here and laugh at it, right? And this is a government who's prioritising planning, prioritising growth. Like, help us understand, how does that happen? Why have we not fixed this problem?
So, well, we'll see whether we are going to fix it, because a member of the House of Lords has put down an amendment to the current planning bill to say we should change that. So we'll see if the government accepts it. But the government should obviously accept that amendment, and if they don't, I think they're not as serious as they should be. But when I published this as a Substack, I got loads of people telling me that it was being unfair to wildlife, and this will be the thin end of the wedge, and soon. So no, there is a constituency for every anti-growth measure, and that's why a government has to be willing to be unpopular, and it has to sit down and decide with whom is it willing to be unpopular. And I think supporters of pigeons should be in the government's category. Because a country that stops building because of a nesting pigeon is not going to achieve growth. It's not serious.
But it's always, to your point, more difficult. So everyone agrees the nesting pigeon, and I'm now going to reveal my total lack of wildlife knowledge, but there will be some nesting birds which are endangered.
Yep.
And then it's like, well, we shouldn't disturb the endangered birds.
Absolutely.
And then who's responsible for creating a list of which birds
There's
are
already a
endangered and
list.
how many? But it's always in the nuance,
Yeah,
right? And
it
that
is,
is the thing. And all of these things happen from good intentions. I think that the sort of, the proliferation of regulation and all of the difficulties came because there was some tragic accident and someone wanted, we must have a rule to prevent that. Or there was a kind of, we must, protect this particular species or this particular, kind of tree is endangered. All of those things come from good intentions. And so I wholeheartedly agree with Tim that you just have to accept the trade-offs. And I think really being upfront, and that was kind of, again, back to the employment question, like you can keep on raising the minimum wage. You will make it much harder for younger people in particular, lower skilled people to get jobs. That is a trade-off. You can have good public policy arguments either way, but you've got to choose. I think, Ruth, on your kind of more like what is the problem, I also think in growth, the temptation is to go for a shiny industrial strategy or some exciting ideas. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of doing the basics well. So I don't think there's any growth strategy that is going to work unless we have a sustainable fiscal position and some sort of certainty over taxation, that you don't have a business community that is kind of very nervous about what is going to happen in tax. So you have to start with kind of like a stable fiscal strategy. I think you have to make public services as efficient and effective as possible. That has fiscal benefit, clearly, but it also has kind of human capital benefit. If you have a school system that churns out really well-educated kids that are, remain top of the league tables for reading and, hopefully have even better math skills than they currently have, that will be like the best start that you can do. I think you've got to think about why is it that it takes us, back to your point about regulation, why does it take us so long to build things? And there's, and then I think Dominic Cummings had an idea about trying to do project speed, like what can we do in this country to speed up, and that for lots of reasons didn't get off the ground. But I do think there is a really interesting argument to be had there about what would you streamline if you wanted to say it's fantastic the government's investing more in infrastructure, how are we going to make sure that money is spent quickly and effectively? And those are all the basics, but they're hard. And so I think kind of making sure that you don't lose sight of like actually how do you do good government, get the basics as streamlined and effective as possible, and then let's think about some like exciting shiny things on top.
And they're hard, but they're not as announceable.
They're
not as scoreable in a forecast.
No.
But actually, by the end of a parliament, you might be really glad you did it.
I agree with that, but I do take a point. They don't fill your grid. You've got no good conference announcements from that on.
Yeah. James, help us understand the politics of this and how hard it is to face up to those trade-offs.
So I think the only way you can really do it is if you have a political strategy that is rooted in the kind of the economic diagnosis, and you always need to work with a slogan. So that previous governments had get Brexit done, levelling up. We can question whether those were the right things to do, but you had a kind of a single goal that you could hang all of this pain on. So when a minister was going to go, we are going to build this new town here, or we're going to kill that pigeon there. You knew what it was for, and you kind of had this intellectual vision connected to a political strategy that gave the minister confidence to kind of ride through the pain, but also kind of your person on the street and ability to understand what is the kind of goal this is for. I mean, it's hard enough getting the economics right and the politics right separately, but joining them up, I think, is one of the major challenges if you really want to reform a country. That we're only starting on.
Well, there's just one thing, I don't know if Ruth, you remember this, but George always used to say that good economics is ultimately good politics. And that was one of his kind of actual core beliefs, that actually, if you did the right thing for the country in economic terms, you could, with a little bit of time and a little bit of luck, but in general, that was always going to be good politics. And I would really like to believe that that is true. I think that definitely was true in that era. I think it was helped, to your point, the Conservative Party, or the coalition government, came in with quite a clear mandate on fixing the public finances, which helped them then, exactly as you've said. Everyone knew they were elected to do this. They told people it was going to be painful. It was painful. There was a sort of an acceptance of that. I worry a bit now that we're in a political environment where good economics is not necessarily good politics, and I'm not sure how we manage that, and I think we're all sort of trying to adapt. So, what does a multi-party system mean? And if you have a party that sort of doesn't seem to engage with reality and isn't punished for doing that, how does a government or an opposition respond? But I would like to think that in general, good economics still is good politics.
Maybe part of the difference here is the sort of nature of the economic challenge, and maybe when you're coming in straight after the financial crisis and dealing with some cyclical issues, then it's easier to say that good economics and good politics go together, whereas if you're trying to fix the supply side and the benefits are often felt beyond that parliament, maybe that's a harder sell, but I'd like to believe it too, that's for sure. What about, my question's completely gone. No, this fiscal point I think we should talk about, right? Because often growth policy, you sort of talk about growth policy and then you talk about tax policy or fiscal policy as if they're separate things. And Eleanor and Tim, you've both made the point that stable fiscal policy is kind of an underpinning of a good growth policy, but equally, if what the Chancellor faces this autumn is a black hole, as most of us expect, then filling that is likely to cause some short-term economic pain, truthfully, however she does it. What's all of your advice to Rachel Reeves this autumn in facing that problem if she had growth kind of top of her list? James, can I put you on the spot?
I mean, I think one of the... So I used to work at the Bank of England, so I see everything through the lens of like monetary policy, and I think that we can't do anything within 5 years on the supply side stuff we've talked about. It's all about getting interest rates down, if you want to have an effect on living standards in the short term. And so in that context, bringing down interest rates, which are high in the UK relative to even higher than France, is really important. And they are particularly painful for the UK at the moment because the public finances are very sensitive to interest rates because we've got a big debt and because the way we're managing the losses from QE. We're trying to do an investment-driven growth model, and investment responds to interest rates. And if you're doing like long-term projects like a new town that's like 30, 40 years, just one extra percentage point of interest can like double the cost of it. And it also really matters for the cost of living, people's mortgages, but also people's bills, because if it's going to cost twice as much to build the reservoir in Abingdon, that means that like Oxfordshire residents' water bills are going to have to be twice as high. So it is really important to get interest rates down, and at the moment we've got this macroeconomic strategy, which is effectively loose fiscal, tight monetary policy, and we should really be doing the opposite. So I think something that the budget could usefully do is swap that around. So if you have like a big fiscal tightening now, and you get those interest rates down, you potentially have a fantastic. It's pain in the short term when the tax rises hit, and before the kind of good effects when interest rates start feeding through. But you've got this massive tailwind going into the next election. And so if I was the Chancellor, for the next 2.5 months, I'd be doing regular joint press conferences with the Governor of the Bank of England saying, yes, we're going to have to raise taxes, and you've got the Governor standing right next to her going, and we will lower interest rates, and have that kind of coordinated macroeconomic strategy.
You've brushed over what that would imply, though, right? Which is massive tax rises, because you're not just filling a black hole, you're trying to kind of flip the fiscal monetary balance, right?
And I think you really need more headroom, yeah. The next few years are going to be really volatile. You've got a fragmenting global trade system. You've got wars happening in different parts of the world. You need this kind of fiscal firewall to protect Britain against that.
And should spending cuts play a role, or would you do it all in tax?
There are obviously some bits of spending that are probably unsustainable long term.
Okay.
Which I will let them talk about.
I think I've been annoying enough. Eleanor?
Yeah, I think there's something very funny there. That I was thinking, I'm not sure I want to talk about tax rises, but I'm very happy to talk about spending cuts. Classic party political divide. I do think on the tax rises that she should look for the simplest, least distortive, and definitely not inflationary measures. Yeah. So if I were, here are your list, I would kind of rule out anything that was, I would not touch VAT because of the inflationary impact. I would not try and find clever wheezes. And this is hard because of the manifesto commitments, but I would try not to create new fiddly taxes. I would try to say, look, let's keep this as simple as possible. And in a kind of longer term tax reform, I would definitely go a sort of, broader base, lower rates would be my approach. But I do think you're going to need spending cuts because I think that the tax rises, I can't envisage a world where we've already had the largest ever tax-raising budget, and it's followed by the second ever, the even bigger tax-raising budget. I think that is going to be politically difficult for them, but also I think it is bad for the country. I don't know what she is going to raise taxes on that aren't going to have a growth impact, and maybe you have to accept some of that, but I would want to share the load and definitely look at spending. That is politically hard, but clearly there are several budgets which are unsustainable.
Tim, let me let you come in on this question, and then, sorry, I've messed up the timing, I think, so we'll take some questions.
So I agree with James that we should have much looser monetary policy and much tighter fiscal policy. And one of the benefits of that is it would hit people like me, because I've almost paid off my mortgage. Interest rates are now irrelevant to me in terms of, I don't want lower interest rates, I'm about to be a net saver. But that's a good thing. I'm the sort of person you should want to hit. I'm certainly the sort of person that the Labour Party should want to hit. I'm older than average and richer than average. And by and large, it was people like me who did okay during COVID. We couldn't spend money in the usual way and our savings racked up. It was young people who suffered then. It's young people who gain most from low interest rates because they reduce mortgage bills, but they also tend to reduce rent bills. So I think there's an intergenerational aspect to James's thing. In terms of which taxes I would raise, I wrote a piece recently for Nesta on why we should follow New Zealand and levy VAT on everything without exception. The only thing they don't levy VAT on in New Zealand is domestic rents and domestic house purchase. Everything else has VAT, or general sales tax as they call it, at the same rate. And that gets rid of all the nonsense of discussing exactly how a piece of leather was treated when you make a belt, because that determines its VAT classification, or whether there's a chocolate dot on a gingerbread man, because that determines the VAT classification. Very small and very large marshmallows are not liable for VAT, but middle-sized marshmallows are. And if that's not the definition of insanity, and it causes all sorts of hassles for business. So I wouldn't keep it at 20% at that point, not least because if you put it on everything, you raise 180 billion, and that's more headroom than he needs, and it would allow a big cut in interest rates and a sizable cut in VAT. It would be a net tax rise, but that is what I would do. I would simplify the tax system.
Right, let's take some questions from the audience, and if it's okay, we might slightly overrun because I think we started a little bit late. Yes, someone got a microphone? I think we have to wait for a microphone to come to you, sorry.
No, they won't hear you at the back.
I'm not in charge of the microphones.
I wonder if the panel's worried about...
Can you say who you are?
Yes, Adam Swirsky from currently the East Midlands Combined Authority. I wonder if the panel's worried about a low-growth culture setting into the country. So, young people aren't expecting, having had 15 years of this, not expecting things to get better, and all parts of the system start to get into defensive mode rather than thinking about, growing the pie.
Great, let's take 3 questions. So there was one there somewhere, I think? No? Okay, we'll take this one. Any ladies got a question? Yeah, we'll come to that.
Hi there, Mohammed Michal. I work for a consultancy called Canvas. You've all touched on regulation a little bit, at least. And what we see kind of politically is quite attractive is we've got 20,000 lines of regulation. There's a fundamental piece here about regulating the world differently that doesn't seem to get much of a mention. Have you given any thought to what that might look like and how politically difficult that might be to move to a principles-based model with higher enforcement as opposed to a rules-based model with almost no enforcement whatsoever? And also, what does that mean for just the sheer number of regulators? I think we're at, 130, 140-ish? That can't be sustainable because you have too many people in offices writing new rules every single day. So just some thoughts around how the government should tackle that.
Great question. And there was one there.
Hello, hi, I'm Maddie from Behaviour Insights team. My question is around AI and the impact on the jobs market. So even if you don't believe some of the sort of more sort of hysterical views about AI taking over all of our jobs, it will have an impact, and quite a radical one, quite fast. I was wondering if you can reflect on that, but also think if you were the government today, what should you be doing today that they're not already, that looking back from the time of the next election, you would sort of want them to have done now rather than wait for things to unfold into the future?
Okay, low growth culture, regulation, and AI. I might ask you to pick your favourite question and come in on that. Eleanor?
Low growth culture. I have a real worry about that in terms of more generally the political environment. And actually, so what worries me is that there's a kind of depression, nothing is going to get better, all of these parties have let us down, the world is looking very bleak. We should vote for someone new and shiny and different, for whom, gravity doesn't seem to have any impact on. And that is what makes me nervous. I think that the economic situation can change around, and I think you've seen in this country, we've had periods of low growth and sort of economic depression followed by high growth. So fundamentally, I'm not worried that it can't change. It could definitely change, but it's the sort of collective faith in politicians and the sort of rules of norms of society, whether we still believe that they can make the change, or whether we think actually the lesson from America and from this country is that we need to elect someone who is going to throw out all of the kind of thing, the democratic norms, because they're not working for us. So that is the bit that worries me more than the sort of economic depression becoming entrenched.
Tim, you wanted to come in on that and then pick another question?
No, you said one each, so I'm going to go in order and pick the next one then. I agree with you. Just as we should always measure outcomes rather than inputs, so we should always regulate by outcomes rather than thousands and thousands of lines on rules. Last time I remortgaged, because it was a variable rate mortgage, they asked me whether in 5 years' time, if mortgage rates had risen, what I would do. Now, my mortgage was quite small at this point, so I said, well, I'd just save less. But that was not an allowable answer, according to whichever financial regulator regulates the building society. So he said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't give you the mortgage if that's your answer. You need to try again. So I told him that I was really vain and spent a lot of money on hairdressing. And that, believe it or not, I said to him, you have no idea what I look like, which was true, because it wasn't a video call. And I told him I spent 100 quid every 4 weeks doing my hair. And that I would stop doing that and go to a regular barber's. And that was an acceptable answer. Now, that's just nuts. That's nuts. So yes, I'm with you on that one, 100%.
The panel does not endorse lying to your mortgage advisor, but that was a very good example, Tim. James.
That leads into the AI question.
Yes, sorry, is that all right?
Long term, it could be transformative, but our problem at the moment is that it's not diffusing enough and affecting jobs enough. So there are several ways you can respond to it. I think you've got to prepare people for it. You've got to build out the social safety net so that it's there when people change jobs and they don't fall into penury. You've got to beef up active labour market policies to give people the training they need, and the government's doing versions of all of those things. Probably need to do more eventually, but I would be wary of doing things that slow down that diffusion process, because our problem at the moment is we are not using these technologies enough. And there are these studies of law firms in the UK relative to the US. They are far ahead of us in using those things. And it looks like we are quite exposed to jobs being replaced in the UK by AI, but really, if you take law, we've got the high value jobs there where people are making, they're taking the executive decisions. The low value stuff's often been shipped out of the UK. So a lot of this AI stuff is going to be complementary to the jobs we have here rather than substitutes. And we shouldn't be getting in the way of that process, because ultimately it will make us much better off as long as we build out that safety net.
Great, thanks, James. Well, look, a really enjoyable and thoughtful discussion, very wide-ranging. So I'm sorry we didn't have loads of time for questions, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you really enjoy the rest of the conference.